Okay, so I don't think I know absolutely everybody. Most of you I do know, and you either know me, I think, from Morley College or from Slaughterhouse Print Studio, where we are at the moment. I set that up with my husband Alex 10 years ago, and we sort of built under a print studio that's you know, survived the last year, so that's good. So I've been involved in printmaking for a really long time, and it's had a massive influence on my work, and it sort of informs everything I do. But I wanted to talk today about sort of how it works together with the other things that I do, and how the printmaking affects the other things that I do. And I suppose when I was putting the talk together, which I have to say took me quite a long time, and I had to take a lot out, I sort of realized that I wanted to talk about everything that I do, so not just about the print, because printmaking's just, I really use printmaking to sort of help me decide about everything that I do, but I don't really, I don't think I describe myself just as a printmaker as such, even though you might think that I am because of everything I'm sort of involved in. So I make a lot of prints, but the sort of printmaking feeds into the other things that I do as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so thinking about what I wanted to, and thinking about the work as I was putting the talk together, it seemed important to just explain a little bit about how I go about making work, and how I've chosen what I make work about. And I suppose that's like a lifetime of choosing, but there's some key things perhaps along the way that made me choose the things that I look at. And I wanted to sort of talk about those a little bit. I want to talk about, I suppose, how I've learnt how to continue to practice as an artist, because I don't think that's a very easy thing to do. And I think it's, you know, if any of us are making work, I think it's really, you know, it's an achievement sometimes to be able to do that. And I suppose the way I've done that is I've found a way of making work about what I find around me, and how I've found a way of looking in order to inform, so that I can find things that I can make work about, if that makes sense. And I hope that I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of how I look at the world, and what I'm looking at, and how that turns into prints or paintings or drawings or whatever it turns into. So the talk is roughly chronological, but it jumps around a little bit. And by chronological, I'm going to start back in the 1980s when I was at college, coming up to some work that I did very recently in this last year. And there are sort of, so it's roughly chronological, but there are sort of things grouped together at the same time, where I'm trying to sort of show you how I've looked at, I suppose, where themes have come across the work. Themes is a horrible description, isn't it? But I can't think of a better way to sort of say how we, in our minds, sort of have these things that are relevant to everything that we're doing. And as we're going through, I'll try and pick up on some of those as well. And I'll probably miss a lot, and I'll probably say some things that are perhaps not quite right as well. But anyway, we'll see how I get on. So I trained at the Slade as a painter, and I went there from what was a very traditional foundation course, which was painting in the life room for 3 days a week, painting in the still life room for 1 day a week, and working in the print room for a day a week. And I did some printmaking on my foundation, and then when I was at the Slade, I painted and painted, and I was really struggling in my last year, and finally sort of plucked up the courage to go into the print room and say, can I come and do some prints? And they said, of course I could, and that was a really very instrumental in what I carried on doing after that. So it's now not working. Typical. Okay, so I wanted to just put this print up at the beginning of the talk then. So this was made at the Slade. And as you can see, I was looking at Picasso at that time, and it's a straight copy. It's the first print I made at the Slade. It's a copy, if you like, of a print by Picasso, and it's one of the ones where the artist or a viewer is looking at the female figure. And it was sort of very much in my mind at that time, that sort of feeling of being female and 20 and what was going on in life. But I suppose that thing about looking and being observed and observing is something that now that has continued, is a continual thread through the work. So the other thing that was really important at that time then was just learning. So I did etching and was just learning to, I've been told, actually, I was told to leave my plate in the acid and go away and come back. And I still say that to people sometimes, because it was almost a revelation to me that your prints can have a life of their own if you let them. Okay, so I, a few years later, went to Wimbledon School of Art and did an MA in printmaking. And when I was there, I was really, I wanted to learn, you know, all the techniques that I could really. But what I particularly ended up doing was a lot of lithography with a great artist and lithographer, Simon Burder, who was the technician there at the time. And what was important about that was understanding, possibly for the first time, the idea of colour layering and the effects that colour have on each other. And I found that that was really, really important back into my painting as well. And I can remember very clearly there was a Braque exhibition at Tate Britain, and I just thought these things were stunning, and they were stunning to me because of the use of colour, very, very delicate colour having an effect on other colours, and the way in which you would put a colour underneath very deliberately to affect the colour on the top, not for the colour underneath necessarily, but for the colour on the top. And Edward Vuillard was the same sort of thing, and there was a very lovely book in the library at Wimbledon, and those prints were very instrumental in what happened for me next. I was really lucky to see the Matisse exhibition in Paris around that time. I think it was early 90s. And yeah, I just started to really think about colour and the way in which you lay colour on top of colour. And I suppose from printmaking terms, how you use colour with as little as possible in a way to make the most happen. I've lost my cursor now. Where's my cursor gone? I actually have. No, there we go. We're back. Okay. So I was painting in East London, a studio in East London, and I started going up to Scotland. I first went to Scotland about 30 years ago with some friends, and Scotland and working up there has almost, I think, shaped my whole life as an artist since I first went there. And it shaped it in loads of different ways, to be honest. I found a place where I could safely sit outside and paint and draw, and nobody really cared less what you were doing. And I found a place where I could concentrate and just do it, if you like. So living in the city, working, teaching, being busy, sometimes you don't get much work done. And I just found that I had a month or 5 weeks or 3 weeks or a week. It didn't matter how long I went for, but I just started making work there. And have continued to do so, although I didn't go last year or the previous year, but those were the first 2 years for 30 years probably. So I was painting, and these were paintings in London, so concerned with the same things, with the idea of the horizon line with the sky and where those two things meet and where you sort of confuse and lose the distinction between them. And as I've continued to paint in Scotland, I suppose what I've looked at has changed. So a long time ago, for a long time, I was painting skies in London and the horizon and buildings against the sky. And I suppose I started, they became more and more abstract. And a couple of, so I was making more and more abstract paintings because I was responding quickly to the landscape and they were getting less and less detailed, I suppose. I was also looking at the sort of man-made elements in the landscape, and they were really important to me, the sort of place where the man-made and the natural sort of join. And then, yeah, that continued really, and has continued for all of that time in those visits to Scotland and in the work I did here. And these are two paintings that are actually much later than those earlier ones that I just showed you, just talking about looking for the shapes in the landscape at this point. And I think that these start to be informed by now by the printmaking, because I'm sort of making decisions about compositional decisions, which are about making shapes and finding new things in the landscape that I might make something from. If that makes sense. It doesn't quite make sense, but yeah, we'll see. Sorry. So these are some much later paintings, and I think they sort of become a bit sparer. And I think I was just looking at them before the talk started. I think it suddenly occurred to me that the space in the paintings is almost like the space that you get in prints, because you start being aware of the white space of the paper, and I think these paintings are doing the same thing. So way back, I was looking at the landscape. As you can see, it's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly beautiful looking westwards, and then, excuse me, you've got the sort of village the other way. And I would make drawings, and at this point made some prints of that landscape. Excuse me. These were drawn there. I made a series of etchings called Scottish series. There are about 20 of these. The plates were drawn in Scotland, but they were only line drawings, and I brought the plates back to London and then worked on them. And I expected the line drawings to be really beautiful, and that would be my job done, but they weren't. They were really dull. And so these plates were worked on back in London. And in fact, all of the work on them was from memory, really, and from what I knew the place looked like. Because the thing that's happened as I've gone back there time and time again is I've started to build up knowing what it looks like and knowing what I want things to look like when I make them. And there's a real joy in that repeated looking and the way in which that then can inform what you can do, that you can sort of draw on it as a thing that that always informs what you're doing. So all of the tonal work and all of the texture work was sort of worked on in London. And just to say that they became very physical. I don't know if you can see this part here. This is a very, very heavily bitten part of the plate. And the sort of process of that sort of really deep bite and using the bite, the deep etch to sort of make spaces in the print, in the landscape, if you like, to bring things forward and to take things back. That's, you know, that is such an important thing for me in printmaking. And in black and white, it works in a tonal way, but when you get into color, you've got the difference in surface, but you've then also got the combinations of what you do with color and where you put it in relation to each other. And printmaking, you know, it because of the way in which you have to consider what you're doing, you have to make it work with almost as little as possible, then you know, it really informs your painting as well. This was a later series. These are called Small Rock Pool, and they, again, I'd drawn only the line, and then the rest of it sort of put in place afterwards. And I say put in place afterwards. On the right hand image, Small Rock Pool 7, you know, it's the etching process that puts those things in place as well. It's letting the plate have a life of its own that made those images happen. So I sort of knew that I wanted to make certain things happen, but then I'll live with the accidents, and I'll work with the accidents, and I'll also perhaps make accidents happen to get, I don't know, so that the plates have a life of their own and the images have a life of their own. And this is then a print made after the rock pool series, and this is made in London, and this is called Urban Rock Pool. And what this is, if I sort of skipped a bit that I wanted to say, which was that I've always been really interested in the idea of pairs of images or groups of images or series of images. And what I was trying to do both in those rock pool images and these ones is compare surfaces or compare different things, but also for me they sort of have a sense of traveling or a sense of passing across the landscape, that I see one thing and I see another, or I see the same thing but it's changed because the light's changed or the weather's changed or I've changed in the landscape. And so these are things, deliberately putting two things together which are urban. One is part of if you like, a hole in the concrete in the yard outside, and the other is drawn from the studio floor. And I suppose I must have made this about 10, 11 years ago. And what it is I was really trying to find my way into understanding where I was then working, because we had moved into the studio at that time. And for me, drawing and looking and recording what's there right next to me is how I do that. It's how I find, it's like how I find my way back into making the work. So that was what I was doing at that point. I was looking at the yard outside and I was looking at the concrete inside, and I was making images about it, but I was looking at them in exactly the same way I was looking at the images in the things I was looking at in Scotland. And it's called Urban Rock Pool because for me, these things start to have the same qualities. I'm looking for the same things. I'm not looking necessarily at the rock pool, but I'm looking at the shape of the rock pool, or I'm looking at the texture, or I'm looking at what throws up as the most interesting thing for me. So it's not necessarily about the rock pool in the landscape, although it can be, and it's not necessarily about the puddle in the pavement, although it can be, but it's about that little distillation, if you like, of looking at those things and learning about what they look like more and more by looking at them more and more. I suppose the other thing that goes on is, you know, living in London and then going outside London, you're very aware of the differences, and it's often very beautiful outside London, and it can often not feel very beautiful in London. But I think the more that you look at things, and the more that I look at things and I look at the minutiae of things, the more beautiful they become. So even the pavement to me is beautiful. Or beautiful, yeah, can be beautiful. It can be, there are things there that I want to look at just as much as that west-facing landscape in Scotland. So what else do I do? So, you know, I go to Scotland and I'll sit on the beach for hours on end, and I'll sit there in the rain or the dark or whatever. And obviously looking at the sea and responding to the sea is a massive part and an exciting thing to do. So I've done loads of paintings of the sea. You saw those ones, those early paintings, they were 20 years ago at the beginning of the slide talk. These are much later, these are more recent, in the last few years, probably some of these. So just, you know, forcing myself to work quickly, forcing myself to record what I see, forcing myself to invent the colour, to make the colour respond to the experience of sitting there trying to paint the waves coming in. It's an impossible thing to do, and I think you know, I do many of these. This is part of, I don't know, 20 paintings done over a couple of days or something. It's like the action of doing the painting starts to make the painting do something else. The action of trying to do the work in that situation. You can see this one's got stones stuck on it. I probably just dropped my brush on the beach and the stones got stuck in there, but they're very visceral. They're a visceral response. These again, you know, this right hand one comes right back to my printmaking. So again, you know, different surfaces, what you do with different surfaces. The pieces of wood are pieces of wood that I might cut, but in this instance, I picked them up and I sort of sloshed some ground on them. I decided not to cover them completely with ground because I wanted to respond to the wood color. I think that's another thing as a printmaker, isn't it? That you're so aware of surfaces that they become really important in what you're doing. So the wood in this is like part of my wood cutting practice. If I'm cutting a wood, I'm really aware of those knots and the bits of the wood, and I didn't want to lose them. I wanted to include them in these pictures. And the color of the wood, we're so aware of, like, our surfaces, aren't we? Like a new piece of metal or a piece of wood or a litho stone. The surfaces are there, and I didn't want to lose them. So these become the paintings on wood panels. There's some gesso in here, but on the right hand side we've got the piece of chine-collé coming in. So that's me, you know, I've made rubbings for years, and I suppose those are a recognition of surfaces and the things that we see as printmakers, the things that get us excited, and then I'm trying to incorporate that into that painting. Another set of drawings, paintings, I'm not sure what they are really, but again, you see on the left hand side, trying to include the elements of collaged rubbings which have been made there in situ, but which also I might have taken to Scotland, and I have been doing this now for a few years, taking rubbings back to Scotland that I've done in the city, so that there's become for me this thing where the man-made surfaces, like the tarmac or the pebble surface or the rock surface or the piece of wood that I'm taking some you know, the surfaces they're all around me, they're part of my life, and then they start to not be one thing or another, and you know, the man-made and the natural, you might lose sight of which is which. That interests me a lot. So again, you know, you can see Tide 3, Tide 5, Tide 6. Again, there's about 20 drawings in this series. Just responding, I take a big old bag of materials. I take anything I can get my hands on, really. I've often picked up like children's crayons because that was the only thing I could get locally. I tend to just carry a massive bag of everything with me when I go up to Scotland these days. But you know, very deliberate, sort of trying to draw the sea, the tide at different times. These were all, there's probably about a dozen of these drawings one summer, and I went to the same place at the top of the beach at the same time every day and did a drawing. So it's another thing to say is that one of the things I have done quite often and continue to do is I sort of set myself it's almost like something I have to do or a project I have to fulfill, and there's something about going back to that same place which helps that process, actually, so that I can think, okay, I'm going and I'm going to when I get there I'm going to do this, this and this, and it's a way in which I've sort of learned to start working again, to give myself something that I have to do. And I suppose going back to that drawing, that was, you know, in my day, I marked my day by going up to the same place at the top of the beach and drawing the sea every day, and just seeing what I saw. You almost take the decision making out because you've made a decision. You sort of make it easier for yourself just to get on with it. So going back to the sea and that whole thing of the movement of the sea, the repetition of it coming in and out, the the corrosion that it caused, the moving around of the landscape caused by the sea. I've looked at that and I've drawn that for a long time as well. I've drawn the seaweed on the beach where it's thrown up, or I've drawn the stones where they've moved. And I started drawing plates, looking at the tide coming in and out. And then later on, I started just sort of throwing them down or throwing stones on them, or trying to abrade them in some way to replicate what was happening with the sea. And I then later started leaving the plates in the sea. And these are some plates that are completely drawn by the sea. Again, I've probably got about 25 in this series, and this series has probably gone on for 6 or 7 or 8 years, that every year I take a few hard ground etching plates with me and I put them in the sea and see what happens. I mean, the one on the left, I mean, it's like a Turner or something. It's quite extraordinary, I think. And then the other ones are like they're sort of then like looking in those rock pools. They're like looking at that concrete. They're like all the little bits that are in the world are all in these images. So they scratch, they get moved around, they get lost in the sea. They come back. A few years ago, I had been talking to a neighbour about a neighbour that we see there because we go to the same place quite often, and I've been talking to him about a plate that I lost the last year. I've done this a couple of times. I've lost them for a day, or I've lost them for a few days, and I've always found them. But this particular plate I never found again. I just lost sight of it. The water pulled it out, and I was sitting in the little cottage that we stay in there in the window the next day, and he knocked on the door and he said, "Is this your plate?" And he'd been walking on the beach, and because we'd had this conversation the day before, he'd found it, and it was found a year later, which was quite nice. It isn't either of those two, actually. But yeah, these they're not, there's no size, they're not all the same size, they're not all the same shape, but these are part of that process of sort of engaging, I suppose, in responding to being there on the beach, looking at the sea, living it, trying to feel my way into what it's doing. A little setup on the beach, monoprinting. And this is, I've got loads of series of these as well. This is one set, part of a set. Again, you know, I don't know how many, I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of things like this. So this was drawing, responding to the tide coming in. So it's like it's a 6 hours of a tide coming in, basically. And as it progresses, you do different things, and you find different things you can do. And print process came into these, you know, printmaking. I had taken water-based inks with me, and as the tide came in closer, I was getting wetter, and then suddenly it was like, oh, this is amazing, because I started getting the splashes of the water on the plate, and because they were water-based inks, I could then print from them. So a real revelation there, really exciting sort of happenstance from the printmaking happened there, which I've continued to use. So yeah, I suppose these are a little bit like those earlier paintings where we were talking about the surface and the wood being part of the drawings. I don't know whether these are drawings or paintings. They're drawings to me, I think. But again, I'm using materials. Part of it, I'm trying to enhance. I'm trying to work with the wood, and that's so like what you do when you're making prints, isn't it? You have to respond to the surface of the material that you're working with. So I'm responding to the material when I'm drawing, and I'm using what I think I need to use to draw what I want to draw. So I'm picking things up quickly and using them to try and capture what's going on when that tide's coming in or it's going out. And so I think, you know, the materials become really important, and your choice about what you use to give yourself the sort of repertoire to sort of capture what you want, or to be as honest to what you see as you can be. And I don't mean see in a figurative way in that sense. I mean it in the broadest sense. And I suppose that's continued into my printmaking. Sorry, I keep losing my cursor. I'm going to come back to that. It's really hard sorting these slides because I had so many I wanted to show you. I wanted to talk about drawing a bit and going back to sort of trying to find a practice. I had struggled to find a place where I could do any work, maybe 20 years ago, something like that. And a few years later, when my daughter was born, I was really struggling to find any place where I could do some work. And the place that I found that I could make work was when I was on the move. And I started drawing when we were moving around in the car or on the train, even with her on the train, I remember once. But I draw these cards, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of these. These are drawn in the car. So when we're traveling, I'm drawing. And these are old index slide cards, so they've got artists' information on them, and there's something really lovely about picking those up and looking at those and drawing on them. And the thing that I like, so it's being able to do something, it's being able to respond to what I'm seeing. It's fun, and I love and have built a way of drawing, I suppose. Not that I always draw like this, but I love drawing really quickly. I love drawing in really difficult situations. I love drawing in the dark. I like what happens when you can't see everything, or when it's past and you have to remember it rather than actually draw what it looks like. So it's about the experience of what you're looking at as much as it is about what you're looking at. And it's again that thing about passing through the landscape, passing over the landscape, and trying to understand it in that way. So other ways in which I draw. So in Scotland, when you cross on a narrow road, there are these places called passing places. And this sketchbook was passing at every passing place along the middle road of the island that we stay on and stopping and drawing at each one. Again, a little project I set myself. I just thought a little bit of me wrapped up, as you need, wrapped up and not wrapped up on an amazingly sunny day. So just sort of about that thing of just being there in the moment and just drawing. I do take a lot of photographs, but I don't use them. I've never actually, the work I'm going to show you at the end of the slide is actually a little bit taken from photographs for probably the first time in my life. What I'm looking at in these photographs is I'm trying to find things that are the same. I take photographs, I think, like I draw. So I'm trying to find information that adds to the other information that I have. So the shapes that you're seeing in urban rock pools or on Scottish rock pools are similar or the same, or I'm looking for those same sorts of combinations of shapes and things and textures, and can then play with the confusion of playing with both of those things in the prints. Finding shapes in the landscape. Sorry. So some prints, this one on the right hand side, I've got the little ticker tape of everybody's faces, which is really annoying over the front. But a rock pool monoprint on the left hand side, and then a trace monotype on the right hand side, where I started including elements of rubbings from rocks and or previously printed pieces of material. So these are probably about 6-7 years ago, starting to revisit, if you like, my my history of making prints. So these elements here are all from prints that are made about these same things, and they're coming back in. So there's starting to be layers of, so these are from little etchings and these are from some woodcuts. They're layers of all of the looking I've ever done. Some more drawings, again, just about drawing on different surfaces and responding to that, and trying to show the sort of the way in which I work across different media, I suppose, simple way of saying it. So this sketchbook, I wanted to talk a bit about colour. This sketchbook, this is an amazing sketchbook. I definitely recommend everybody buying one of these sketchbooks. It's made by Fabriano and it's got this fantastic transparent paper. So you see every drawing underneath and beyond what you've done. So these became a starting point for a set of prints, of which these are 2. Again, there's a lot of these and there's a lot more done later on than these. And these are all taken from that particular sketchbook. And what they are is they're a sort of accumulation of looking at the sketchbook. And I used the layers that I could see in these prints as well. So these are monotypes, about 40 by 40 centimeters. And by this time, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, these prints are made on the press. They're made like paintings almost. So I make a layer, I respond to the layer on the press, and I put the next thing in. So they've got relief elements coming in. They've got sheen colle elements. They've got previously printed elements, and they've got a line sort of linking them together. So they've got a line that comes from those drawings, and the shapes that I'm cutting of the sheen colle or of the cardboard elements that are going in as relief print are part of that process as well. And I just wanted to say to you that so I was drawing from these sketchbooks, and I had a number of these sketchbooks, and they all had different covered colours in different colours, and the colour was so fantastic that started coming into the prints. So it wasn't just about the rock pools, it was about the sketchbook itself and the experience of re-looking at the sketchbook of where those prints came from. So this print is made after that one, and I started, the previous ones are called re-pools, so they're pools, but I felt like I was reinventing the pools. And then these repool series carried on, and again they're from rock pool, they're from drawings of rock pools, but I might include some elements of something found in London in these, or a piece of print that I've made deliberately to put back into these prints. So the sheen colle is sometimes invented sheen colle, so I print it or I draw it ready to go into the print. And again, that's about that sort of process of bringing drawing and the printmaking together. I put this in, I did a series of drawings, these were about 3 years ago probably, and these were very deliberate. I took back to Scotland the idea of working on them like the monotypes. So I tried to construct them like I'd constructed the monotypes. And these have got elements of all of those things that you see in the description. There's paint, there's charcoal, there's drawing. This is a piece of printed material. There's rubbings of surfaces. Again, at this point, I was taking back to Scotland some man-made surfaces that I've rubbed in London. So if you like, it's like my whole life in a piece of work, I hope. Drawings and looking at the puddles is like being this massive thing for me in Scotland because it always rains, so you have to sort of embrace what you can draw. I normally do a blog when I've gone up to Scotland, and I don't know if you've got time to read this, but I'll just let you read it for a minute. Yeah, so yeah, big old dirty grey puddles. The painting was started when the sun was setting, and that's why it's pink in the beginning, but it did change. So I'm taking rubbings of the rocks there. I make sketchbooks and I take rubbings. So these are a series of sketchbooks which were just made deliberately to take rubbings and draw into in that way. Again, sort of constructing the sketchbooks so that I'm forced to fill them. I always take stacks and stacks of sketchbooks with me. I always take stacks and stacks of things with me, and I force myself to use it all before I leave. So I'm working faster and faster by the time I leave. But there's something really liberating in just saying, okay, I've got 6 sketchbooks. I'm going to fill them all before I go home. It makes you do it. So those collage elements coming into these drawings, the one on the right hand side made in the studio, thinking about shapes of rocks and drawings that I had done, and the one on the left hand side made in the landscape, the same as in that puddle photograph. Actually, it's that same track going back towards one of the cottage doors, and that's like a rubbing here of some wood, and that makes the door of the cottage, and this is the track going forward through to the to that place. But I do think that the paper and that the sort of the shape of the paper and the way in which I'm putting pieces down, you know, that really comes out of my printmaking, because you think in flat bits, don't you, in printmaking, and the collage is the same, I think. Right, sorry. Artists that I look at. Robert Rauschenberg, really a big influence. Lovely, just finding interest in the mundane and the normal. I love these collaged and painted and sections, these sort of sequences and repetition and overlaying, and really the sort of the way in which composition is designed in painting by putting these elements against each other. An artist called John Schuler, who worked in the 50s and early 60s on the Sound of Sleet further up in Scotland, very instrumental. He was one of the American abstract expressionists. He studied with Clifford Still. Really beautiful, sort of reducing the looking down to very little. I love those. Sort of the idea of place and things in place. So these wonderful wind combs by Chalida. I love all sorts of aspects of his work. He was a great printmaker, and he did a lot of cut paper things, all things that really interesting. But you know, those sculptures on that coastline, I've never been. It's a place I want to go more than anything, probably. But really interesting. And these Boyle family I think they threw like a pin at a map. It's probably less chance than that, but then would reconstruct what they found at a place in the landscape. Painters like Morandi and Matisse I mentioned already, but I remember seeing a Morandi exhibition years and years ago, and as he continued to paint, being struck by how much he didn't paint, how much he could reduce the objects to very little, to the spaces, to abstract forms. So really important to me. And then Corot, real master at just exploring what the landscape actually looks and feels like to be in. Oh, absolutely brilliant drawing, I think. Corot. And I just threw this in. It's me painting this summer. I decided I'd paint in the car rather than just draw in the car. And this was on the 24th of August. This was going down to Somerset. And these are paintings done in the car. That's one of them. Quite fun. So David Hockney's done that sort of thing, that thing of driving through the landscape, his Yorkshire landscape, which obviously I'm from Yorkshire as well, so that they'd have got big resonance for me. And these sheepfold drawings, I'm not mad on the drawings as such, I have to say, but this idea of locating something in the landscape and locating it again and drawing it again and finding the same thing in the landscape and going back to it, I find that really interesting. Diebenkorn, those people who know me probably know that I love this work, and I love the sort of the exploring of the topography of the landscape and the abstraction of this work, still based in reality, but abstract and beautiful. And this right hand, this is a litho, this bottom right hand one, and these sugar lift here, just that idea of letting the print come into the work, the process, the making of the print, the fantastic things that happen and the accidents of prints being in the work, being apparent in the work. Hamish Fulton I've seen it again, just this idea of, there was a really lovely book of his that I wanted to try and find an image of. I couldn't find an image of, but I liked this image of this idea of exploring a place and telling me about that continued exploration of a place, looking at it in different ways. A set of photographs of Porthmeor Beach and writing. I have more recently started noting down sounds and things that I've been hearing and looking at as well in writing. And these Christopher Le Brun prints I really like, because they respond to the surface that he's working from. They're scarcely prints. They're in that he's done little work on the blocks themselves, but they're just responding to the blocks. This is the work that I've been doing most recently. There is a little bit of work after this, but I wanted to show you some of this work. And from the that sense of, going back to that one, that sense of sort of the surface and rubbing, I was invited to go to a place in Scotland called Cardrossel, the St. Peter's Seminary, a derelict concrete building. And these are some rubbings of the concrete there. They're like the South Bank, where the concrete's like, it's got wood effect in it. Absolutely brilliant. I was making this work the early part of the year. I went up to the place, which by chance is just off the road that we travel up to go to the island. So it immediately had huge resonance for me going there. And I made some sketchbooks before I went. And these are the sketchbooks that I took with me. And these are some images of the things that I drew. So this one was purely was noting sounds and things that I saw, and just, you know, different ways of looking at things. And again, this was my way of thinking my way into what I might do when I got there, but also just telling myself to do something. So I started drawing on the train, and I didn't stop till I got off the train when I got home. And this is the building, this fantastic concrete building, which was a priest's seminary. And people have got inside it and they've graffitied on it. And I loved this piece of graffiti, which was actually trying to draw what they saw inside. I thought that was absolutely stunning. So I'd never really drawn from photographs, but what I did was refer to some films that were made on the place when it was still being used by the priests. And there's some amazing footage on YouTube, and these are two stills, you know, just screenshots that I took then of these priests and the spaces of this amazing derelict building. And I started making some work from them. And I'm including the screenshot and the windows, because that becomes quite important this year. So this was before the lockdown, but I suddenly was looking at those as the starting point for these prints. And I wanted to just talk about what else was going on here, because this is taken from those priests that you just saw in the previous image. And the wood element that I saw on the concrete and the rubbings that I took has come back into the print by both being included here in the etching. This is soft ground of some wood being put back into the print. And then I also printed from a piece of wood in the background as well to put that colour in. So they feel, for me, you know, it's quite weird bringing figures back into the work. I wanted to show you this in relation to that Picasso copy that I did at the beginning, because I've spent years not drawing people, but suddenly people started coming back into the work because of these figures that I saw in these prints. And I really liked that. But I wanted to sort of say to you that they also rely on the way I've looked at the landscape and the way I responded to that landscape, where that funny place was in the landscape in these prints. And this was actually a drawing of the priest from one of those photographs, but it came out and it looked like this, and it feels like graffiti guys in hoods. So, you know, just like sort of playing with what happens when you draw and when you respond to something, and going with it when it does something else is really important, I think. And, you know, that comes out of printmaking, doesn't it? You know, learning to live with that accident. So I was working on these, and then, you know, we got locked down last year, etc. And my dad died almost 11, 12 months ago now. And so I'm going to start getting upset now, weird. I started to draw him, and the thing that I was doing was I was drawing him from photographs I had taken, screenshots that I had taken of him online. And so I'm just going to finish with a couple of images from that, and that's the end of what I wanted to show you. So these are some pictures that I've done this year. Following on from this one, which is just bringing back together that wood element. And this is actually relating to the trees that you saw behind the Cardross Seminary. But these are actually, so I'm thinking about those trees and the line of the concrete. And but these trees are drawn in the yard in Stockwell, but they refer back to Cardross, and they bring the set of prints back to me and my place and where I am. And little ticker tape thing's really annoying. And then these last three are some prints that I made in this series, but that my dad started to come into these. So these are my dad from the drawings and from the photographs I took on screen, really, talking to him via FaceTime. And we come back right round to that viewing and being viewed in these last couple of images, which is the screen. It's a screenshot of the screen, if you like, with myself in the screen, looking at my dad and myself reflected in the screen. And then as a final one of my dad in that series. And yeah, I just wanted to stop there, really. So that's me, last 25 years, no, 30 years to now. Yeah, okay.